Couple words about hymns. First hymn today, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Any Lutherans out there? Yeah. This is Reformation Sunday, so I threw that in so that we'd have a sense of, what Martin Luther was thinking back in the 1530s about a world full of devils and all that. It's fascinating, and it's good for us to remember where we came from. Two more hymns coming up. You probably don't even know those hymns. They sound strange. We walk by faith and not by sight, and Go to the World. You might want to have a hymn book with you. And as you know, there's no place for a hymn book in these chairs. We want to make them light and stackable and no nonsense. So when you come in from whatever direction, this is a work in progress. We got to remember to get our hymnals. Now, the hymn book weighs about 37 pounds. Michael's coming out to pass them out. I had a conversation with the prophet of the Mormon church who was in my church in Salt Lake City. I'm not making this up. He loved our hymnal because it had 835 or some songs in it. We only sing about 200 of them because the other 600 are all about nothing but the blood and all the covered by the blood, and hymns we just don't sing here. But among the ones we do sing, there's some wonderful new song, and we're going through them, as you've noticed. And a lot of them have familiar tunes, but not all of them. So I suggest getting a hymnal, taking a look at it. This is the best hymnal in Presbyterians. We've been known for having the worst hymnal, but this one's not that old. It is the very best, and I can't wait for the next one because people keep writing great music. Anyway, there you are. Good. Like I say, if somebody has trouble carrying it to their chair, maybe we can have some Christians out there to lug one little Sherpa, be a hymnal Sherpa for somebody, right? Okay, enough of that. Let's go. Dear God, thank you for this wonderful celebration day. This is a brand new day, and we feel like we have inherited a great gift. Amen. So in today's text, we've got the story where these two disciples, James and John, come up to Jesus and say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." Which is just like a couple of kids, two brothers trying to pull one over on their dad, right? "What is it you fellows want?" Jesus says, eyeing them. They say, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left when you come into your glory." And Jesus says, "You don't know what you're asking. To sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those to whom it has already been prepared." And Jesus says, right, they have no idea what they're asking, because in the Gospel of Mark, the phrase Jesus coming into his glory means, in fact, Jesus mounting the cross. And that's because Mark's whole gospel is an explanation of the inevitability of the cross. Because Mark knew that people in his day, this is 40 years after Jesus died probably, those people had trouble accepting the humiliation of the cross. It didn't fit with their grand idea of Jesus as a king. So what does Mark do? He doubles down on this means of Roman execution, this cross, saying that the triumph of Jesus is not going to take place by him mounting an earthly throne, but in fact by mounting a criminal's cross. So to be at Jesus' right and left hand when he comes into his glory, in quotes, as James and John want to, is in fact to be at his side on neighboring crosses when he is crucified. I'm giving away the whole story of the gospel right there. And you remember who got to do that? Who got to be on those neighboring crosses? A pair of common thieves. They weren't even white-collar criminals. That's why Mark has Jesus say, "You have no idea what you're asking." It is ironic in the nth degree. So, we know so little in this world. We are so small, and the world is so complex. The following poem by the Persian poet Rumi puts us in our place. Who makes these changes? I shoot an arrow right and it lands left. I ride after a deer and find myself chased by a hog. I plot to get what I want and I wind up in prison. I dig a pit to trap others. I fall into it myself. I should be suspicious of what I want. Sometimes things work out so much worse than we ever imagined, but sometimes things work out better. 20 years ago, when I was senior pastor at First Presbyterian Church, Ashland, Oregon, our pastoral associate applied to become associate pastor. Now that sounds like nothing, right? Just an inversion of a title, but it was a big deal. She had become our pastoral associate 4 years earlier, and hiring her with that job title was kind of a title, but it really didn't mean anything. It was kind of provisional. But she had this important task of leading our youth program and also our children's ministry, and she was good at both. It's hard to find people who are good at both. She did astonishingly well for all 4 years, so she had asked to have her status upgraded to a title that people would recognize, associate pastor. It's a title that mainline clergy understand as the gold standard for that particular position. Well, someone on the personnel committee back then didn't like this for reasons I never really understood, said that it set a bad precedent. That person managed to just block it. And I looked at that and I thought, this is the worst possible thing that could happen. I felt that our pastoral associate was more important to that church at that moment in its history than anyone else on the staff, including me. She'd built a terrific program. She had earned the trust of all the parents and all the kids, and I worried about what that flat no to her would mean. Well, as it happened, she began right away to look around for a church that would fully appreciate her skills. And soon she let me know she'd found a church that wanted her to be their solo pastor. Well, I was happy for her. It meant she would get to use all her pastoral gifts. But personally, I was crushed. I was angry at myself and the church for letting her go. Well, that was the beginning of the end of my time there in Ashland, which turns out was actually fine. I'd been there 11 years by then, and looking back at my career now, I've served 4 marvelous churches in the intervening years. Well, our able pastoral associate went on to serve as a solo pastor with distinction and serve some other churches as well. And one of those churches happens to be this church, where she is currently serving as our children's minister. Because I'm speaking, of course, of the Reverend Bunny Oliver. Now, do you suppose that she, a United Church of Christ clergy person, would be here at Southminster had she stayed at Ashland as I had hoped? No way. But back then I thought, damn, life is over. Now, nearly all of you know, I imagine, the following ancient Chinese proverbial tale. Farmer's horse runs off. Neither he nor his son can catch him. His neighbor says, "How bad for you?" And the farmer says, "Oh, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing." Next day, the horse returns with the mate, a beautiful wild mare. The neighbor says, "Oh, how fortunate for you. Now you have 2 fine horses." The farmer says, "Honestly, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing." Next day, the farmer's son attempts to tame the wild mare, and in the process, he's thrown and he breaks his leg very badly. The neighbor's response is, "Oh, how bad for you, such sorrow." The farmer, with tears in his eyes this time, says, "I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing." Next day, the army comes through. and conscripts the neighbor's 2 sons against their will and leaves the farmer's son who has the broken leg. Neighbor, through his own tears, says, "How lucky you are. You still have your 1 son." And the farmer says, "I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing," which he has to say because it's a story without an ending, because our lives are infinitely complex. But we don't act that way, right? We look at the state of our life today and count up our regrets and blessings, maybe too early, maybe always too early. Some people are trapped, by regret. Oh, if I'd only had that one thing that had worked out differently. Or if I'd only made a different choice back when I was 21. Garrison Keillor once said, "Some luck lies in not getting what you thought you wanted, but in getting what you have, which once you have it, you may be smart enough to see is what you would have wanted had you known." The disciples, James and John, said to Jesus, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You don't have any idea what you are asking for." As the gospel writer Mark tells his story, James and John came into this Jesus enterprise without any agenda or ambition, in fact, because Jesus was just walking by them as they were mending their nets by the Sea of Galilee. And as Mark tells it, they were so attracted to this young Galilean peasant at the height of his powers that they dropped everything and they followed him. He was that beautiful, according to Mark's gospel. Mark says they looked at him in awe. Something about him was compelling. It might have helped them to remember how smitten they had been in the beginning, It would do us all good to let go and step back from time to time. We will probably find out over time that maybe that decision we made back when we were 21 was better than we thought. Our friends in Alcoholics Anonymous have it absolutely right. God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know that this world is more wondrously ordered than we could ever imagine, maybe. So sometimes it's best to just suck it up and trust God, or serendipity, whatever we call it, because maybe we are all by nature inevitably short-sighted. The novelist W. Somerset Maugham is remembered to have said, "What has influenced my life more than anything else has been my stammer." He wanted to get rid of that. "Had I not stammered, I probably would have gone on to Cambridge, maybe have become a professor, and every now and then published a dreary book about French literature." So let me ask, what fate were you once saved from, right? What did you want as much as James and John wanted positions of honor next to Jesus? The law of unintended consequences pertains absolutely here, right? We come up with what we think are the best ideas ever, and look what happens. Consider the outcomes in 3 categories I'm going to bring up here. First, banning alcohol has time and again led to higher consumption and the formation of criminal gangs, resulting in more and more violent deaths. 2, abstinence-only sex education invariably causes a rise in teenage pregnancies. 3, Overturning Roe versus Wade has led to more abortions in the United States of America. It's counterintuitive in every case, but there it is. Go figure. As the poet Rumi said, I should be suspicious of what I want. This stewardship season, we've been looking at the wisdom of Jack Kornfield, who said, in the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you've lived, and how gracefully you've been able to let go of things not meant for you. Okay? Today, we're looking at three. How gracefully have you been able to let go of things not meant for you? Think about that. Paulo Coelho said, maybe the journey isn't about becoming anything. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you, so that you can be who you were meant to be in the first place. Well, allow me to close with this. I know of a woman named Brianna Martre who spent years laboring over a novel. It was her first. She'd had a great idea for a novel from her youth. She worked and worked on it into middle age. She finally completed it and rested from her labors for a season. Eventually, an agent she knew requested to read it. She went back to it after this long hiatus, printed it out, and read it through from beginning to end. And at that point, she realized that while the idea was original and the story was decent enough, she'd outgrown it altogether. It didn't represent who she was anymore. So she took the manuscript and she began with page 1, folding each page into a series of paper cranes. It was a pastime that she'd engaged in since she was a kid. She folded it through chapter 1 and went, well, why not? Went into chapter 2, and in time she had folded 100 and then 1,000 and then several thousand paper cranes of varying sizes out of this completed manuscript she'd printed out. Now, during the time of the folding, her computer was stolen. And she realized that the only copy of her novel that now existed, as far as she knew, was the one she'd been transforming into a huge flock of paper cranes. Hearing of this and marveling at this unique use of her novel, the management of the Denver airport, she lived in Denver, invited her to install those thousands of cranes along one of their concourses. And after proper TSA checks, they allowed her and a crew of her friends that she'd assembled to enter the airport at night when traffic was low and the moving walkways were left to rest. This took weeks. And when it was finished, she named this grand installation Shadow Happy. Shadow Happy. From her earliest days, she had longed to be a novelist. But in her heart of hearts, she found that it just wasn't her thing. But she turned that huge realization, that letting go, into a work of beautiful relinquishment. James and John asked Jesus if they could be Prime Minister and Secretary of State in his new administration. They had no idea what lay at the end of the road for them in Jerusalem, just a few days ahead. Disabusing them of their desire to always come out on top and never ever on the bottom, he said to them, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." It's not a message that's very popular today. Not every preacher is preaching it. Some notable ones have, in fact, tossed Jesus' teachings overboard in favor of a winning is everything ethic. You win contest after contest after contest, and at the end you bring all your trophies to God. Well, I think the authentic message of Jesus is more relevant than ever. And you find it right here in this humble story. And Jack Kornfeld's three-part rubric for measuring a life is much more in sync with Jesus' teaching than anything that comes out of a winning is everything ethic. How much have you loved? How lightly have you lived? How gracefully have you been able to finally let go of things you wanted so very much, but found you were able to eventually let go of because you realized they were never really meant for you in the first place?